District of Conservation is sponsored by the Committee for a Constructive Tomorrow, better known as CFACT. To learn more about our sponsor, head over to cfact.org. Thanks for listening to the program.
Introducing Oakley Meta Vanguard, the new performance AI glasses designed for athletes. With hands-free capture on an action-ready ultra-wide camera, powerful open-ear speakers, and built-in Meta AI that syncs with your Garmin devices for real-time insights while you train. Take your performance to the next level with Oakley Meta Vanguard. Athletic intelligence is here. Learn more on meta.com.
This episode is brought to you by LinkedIn. Healthcare professionals can lead their careers with LinkedIn. Discover jobs by specialty, preferred shifts, and even desired salary. From mental health therapists to radiology technicians, it's now faster and easier for healthcare professionals to find the right fit. Learn more at linkedin.com/healthcare. Side effects may include faster job placement, improved work-life balance, and increased career satisfaction.
Welcome to District of Conservation. I'm your host, Gabriella Hoffman. This podcast offers a sober examination into all things hunting, fishing, shooting sports, energy, environment, and the public policy surrounding it. And this podcast also specializes in original interviews that you won't hear elsewhere. Here's what I have for you today. Greenland has been a topic of discussion here in the United States. And my next interview is with Dr. Elizabeth Buchanan, who wrote about this subject, even from the vantage point of as an Australian. She focuses a lot on the polar and Arctic issues, has a very interesting national security background. And I'm really thrilled to speak with her because we got connected through a mutual friend, Evie Solheim. And Dr. Buchanan, it's a pleasure to talk to you. I loved the book, and we'll have you talk more into it. And it's so good to connect with you. Yeah, absolutely.
You too. Shout out to Evie. Strong women.
Yes, Evie's wonderful. I've known her for a long, long time. And when she mentioned reviewing the book and talking to you, I was like, I absolutely need to do this because I work a lot in energy policy, critical minerals. And I was like, professionally and just interest-wise, this fascinates me so much. And I've flown over Greenland several times, never been there. I would love to go fishing there once because they have phenomenal fly fishing opportunities, very untapped.
Yes.
And I'm just...
It's such a fascinating overlap with a number of things as well from me professionally. So I'm so happy to be having this discussion.
Yes. Before we dip into the book and your examination into Greenland and why everyone is so fascinated with it, please talk about your background. What do you focus on day to day, and including this book on Greenland too? But what led you to write about it? Yeah.
How far do you want to go back? So I actually finished, secondary school, and I went into medicine surgery. That was going to be my kind of career pathway. But then in my first year of med school, I unfortunately uncovered that I have a psychosomatic response to blood. And I mean, a doctor that faints at the sight of blood is, not ideal, right?
Yes.
So I diverted my life plan and went into sort of like global or liberal arts, I think in the American system you'd call it. But what was really interesting was that was at a time when the Russia-Georgian war was kicking off. And so to be, day-to-day studying international rules, international law, and like political systems, and then in real life watching, the dismantling of that or, actions by a state that are clearly in breach of what I'm learning day to day, and the international community doing very little to be able to curtail or to respond to that aggression, obviously was really interesting. And I'm always someone that's loved a puzzle to solve, right? So I thought, hey, international politics, that seems like a goer. So I finished up university, and I actually went and worked for an oil company, so Royal Dutch Shell, in the Australian market. So nice. So a little bit of commercial background. And I think looking back on my journey, I think it's so important to have such a diversity of lived life experience before you kind of get into government or get into politics. I always think it's quite interesting when people sort of finish high school and then decide they want to be in politics. And I'm like, what's your life experience, right? And I will say that having that kind of energy security and that corporate commercial energy I guess, trial by fire and insight has been so fundamental for all the work I've done since, in the 2 decades since. And so that meant, stepping into a PhD on Russian Arctic strategy. So when I was at Shell, they were trying to understand how they could work, because that was when they were in the offshore Alaskan Arctic. And there's obviously a lot of deals to be negotiated with the Russians in the Russian Arctic. And they needed someone that had, Russian language, but also had an understanding of the political system. So there's a really kind of seamless synergy there for me personally and professionally. And then I went off to do the PhD, obviously, at the Australian National University. Followed that up with a beautiful baby boy, and then headed off to the NATO Defence College, where I did sort of a postdoc on North Atlantic security supply lines and the role of the Arctic. So I've always been, that was about 10 years ago, almost 10 years ago, actually. And so the Arctic has been obviously of interest to me and to a smaller community, but in the last, I'd say, 2 years, it's really, really come alive. And, that has been a good thing professionally, but it's also been a really frustrating thing as well, because of all the kind of disinformation out there about what's going on in that theatre. And that's honestly what led me to write this book about Greenland. I just felt that the discourse was so disingenuous. And unfortunately, it was largely out of the US, which was surprising. You had your media arguing that Greenland, Trump's designs for Greenland were problematic, and it was or even some people were arguing it was embarrassing, and I was kind of like, hold on, you've had a decades-long strategic and political relationship with this country. How can you argue that? Do you know what I mean? So I kind of felt like a Australian coming in for bat for the American interest in Greenland in a roundabout way. So that's how the book came about, and I guess my background. And beyond writing books that I do enjoy doing on either end of the earth in the poles, I also work for the Australian government, although obviously anything I write or say are not the views of the Australian government.
That's a very fascinating background, and I hate to admit I did the inverse of you. I worked in politics first and then started getting private sector experience, but everyone has their own journey.
Offense.
And I wish I had worked.
Does.
And I wish I had worked a little bit in energy, but I've gotten a taste of it on the outside. But I think you bring such an interesting perspective. And as an American, I say thank you, because Australia is an ally. You guys just made a deal with us with critical minerals. So shout out for our presidents doing that. Prime Minister, You're Prime
welcome.
Minister. So we like it because we want to, decrease our reliance on China. So no, I think it's great, that allied nations like yourself. And I don't think there's anything wrong with an Australian writing about Greenland, like Americans having an interest in it too. So now we'll.
Yeah, I do enjoy, the idea. And to be honest, there are quite a few people who are kind of, I guess, thrown by the idea of having the distance and what I could bring to the table. But, you're looking at it the wrong way. I feel like the distance gives such a critical objectivity to the issue.
Sure.
And, you only know about a problem from 5 feet away from a bird's eye view, right? And so that's, what I hope to bring to the issue. And being an Antarctic specialist in my more day job as well, which is obviously a lot more closer to Australia, what was interesting for me was seeing the patterns, right? So Chinese action in the Arctic mirrors quite a bit of what we in Australia have been dealing with for the last decade or so. So it's kind of ringing the bell, if I could say that.
I thought it was a very comprehensive, easy book. So the title for listeners, if they're curious, and we're going to plug the book several times throughout the conversation with Elizabeth today. So You Want to Own Greenland, Lessons from the Vikings to Trump. And I thought it's a perfect time for someone like yourself who has this expertise to write about this. Doesn't matter the country of origin, of course. And I thought it was a really good comprehensive view into it, because we had the discussion that, okay, it was only President Trump who had the interest, but he wasn't the only, not only American person, but he wasn't the only foreign leader who has always been eyeing this. You obviously state that the Vikings had a very interesting stake, and they had a very unique relationship with Greenland, which I would like you to go into. But talk about how in the book you describe this, desire by nations to own Greenland. Technically, for those listening, it's a protectorate under Denmark. Denmark oversees this. They have some autonomy, but they're not independent, as Elizabeth lays out in the book. That's a very important thing to know. They've strived to have it. There is an independence movement. There is a little bit of, I don't know if it's true, since I've seen some of the polling with the recent elections, but they don't necessarily want to become American, but they want to be wholly independent. But it's tricky, as you lay out. But Elizabeth, please talk about like the history briefly from the Vikings to Trump about wanting to quote unquote own Greenland.
Yeah, so it's really, really complex, and that's what I spent such a long period of time trying to lay out the history in a way that was, I felt, honest and respectful for the people of Greenland, but also, I didn't have 600 pages to unpack its history. But I think I want to get, listeners just to bring up on Google, a map of the Arctic, and then that is the bird's eye view. That is the illustrative point of the entire strategic and historical interest of Greenland. So it is quite squarely a North American piece of landmass, right? That's something that maps don't lie, geography doesn't lie, and that's something I keep coming back to in the book. But historically, you mentioned the Vikings, and there was this, fascinating story about, Eric the Red, who I'm sure people are familiar with, at least in kind of a pop cultural or a historical sense. But, he was exiled for murder, as many of the Vikings people, found themselves foul of back in those days. And he actually discovered Greenland. And, it is this fascinating story of how he wanted to lure, I guess, a community with him away from places from Norway, from Iceland, and he said it was Greenland, and it's not, right? It is full of ice and permafrost and very little greenery, but which the inverse is true of Iceland, right, where that's quite green and lush. And yet, so I guess you could say that was the first, marketing example, or one of the first marketing examples in history. So he started a colony, and there was keen interest between the Norwegians and the Danes with Greenland. And then I kind of map how we think that the numbers got to around 2,000 in this colony. Obviously, the indigenous Inuit people were also in Greenland, but more nomadic, and not, into these communities set up by the Vikings. But basically, news travelled less and less back home to Denmark and to Norway about how the colony was going. And, this was at a period in time where trade has always been, the heart of human activity. And so the Vikings on Greenland, they were for a few decades, living lush, and they had, locked down on ivory, so seal and whale, the ivory trade, which was super, super important economically, but it allowed them to also prosper. And then, as with any kind of trade story through history, you have obviously a diversification. You have new points of ivory trade popping up, and that's when we saw Central Asia and Africa come to the table. So Greenland, again, look at the geography, being located where it is, was so far away. So it took time. It was expensive. So they kind of lost out. They weren't competitive. But essentially, you had folks travel to Greenland to check up on the colonies, and when they arrived, essentially there was no sign of them. And so throughout history, and historians have had much more in-depth time and experience in looking at this problem, and I really just kind of spend a couple of pages on it, try to understand what happened to the lost colonies of the Vikings on Greenland. And I think I unpack a few points, some data points that show that there was no mass graves found, so we know that there was no huge Inuit and Viking clash. But also in the last couple of years, there's been really interesting scientific work done on some remains they have found. the Vikings in Greenland, and they've shown, with different bone densities and whatnot, that they clearly moved away from a meat-based Viking diet towards that kind of nomadic fisheries-based Inuit diet. So they kind of had to learn to live with the land and change with the land. Which was really fascinating. So then you kind of fast forward from the Vikings period, and the next time Greenland kind of pops up in historical, I guess, relevance in a key way is World War. And that's obviously, again, we come back to the geography of Greenland and where it is strategically located. So another kind of interesting point is the role that Greenland plays strategically in global weather systems. And that's not something that, with technology or with satellites that has really put Greenland on the map. Yes, it's more important these days when you can inject those technologies, but back to basics, all of the weather patterns that were occurring in Greenland would then kind of shift over the North Atlantic and hit Europe a day or two later. So that was important. The weather that was occurring in Greenland was significant for military planners when they were figuring out D-Day. And so that brought the Nazi Germany interest in Greenland. And so I do, touch on a few points of history and reference about, the Nazi Germany soldiers hiding out in Greenland and bunkering down and being found by the Inuit, and being arrested by the Allies. And then I think the next point of really vast interest in Greenland internationally was absolutely the Cold War. And again, last few years we've had more information. We've had just as security records are declassified and opened on archives, the US is starting to release more information about just what the American government was doing in the Cold War on Greenland. And so in the book, I talk about really cool kind of Cold War projects, Project Iceworm and the nuclear testing.
Can you talk about Camp Century? Because as someone who works in energy, mm-hmm. and I like nuclear energy, and people forget that it's very intertwined with military operations. But can you speak to that? Because I know a lot of nuclear reactor fans and nuclear energy fans would be curious.
The nuclear aspect, So we're not just talking about, the bombers that were carrying nuclear missiles, which we now know again, with the grace of time, the Danish defense records are also getting declassified and open, and we're starting to see that the Danish government knew, and I talk about that in the book, they knew that there were the US government was storing nuclear weapons. There was vessels that had been transporting or they'd been flying over Danish territory, which Greenland is, during the Cold War. And that's completely at odds with the Danish position on nuclear non-proliferation. So again, this whole, melting pot of strategic and political issues when it comes to Greenland, we're going to only know more about it as time progresses and as these archives do open up, we get the real truth of it. But the point about nuclear energy and US military application is so fascinating. And it's something that, as an Australian, we're also learning about as well. So in the Antarctic, they had the US ran a nuclear reactor called Nuki Poo.
We did?
Yes. So
I did not know this.
Okay. So get on Google after this pod, and it is called Nuki Poo. I know it's very crass, but it was essentially at McMurdo Station in Antarctica. So in the 59 or the early 60s, I think it ran, it powered the station. So this is the thing, nuclear energy and the idea we've got these, small modular reactors that are hitting the marketplace. Absolutely, this is technology we need to lean into. But this is not new, right? The US military has worked, and I will talk about Greenland in a second and Camp Century, but the US military has had nuclear energy in some way or another at the heart of its business, right? So they get the application and they get the utility, and it it's a no-brainer, right, once you understand it. So Nuki Poo, it powered McMurdo Station in Antarctica for a little while, and then it started to leak. So the coolant water was starting to leak. So under the treaty, you can't test you can't test nuclear weapons, but this wasn't a nuclear weapon, obviously. It was an energy source, and also it was in support of science, which allows kind of tick, tick, tick in terms of the treaty. So it was powering the science McMurdo Station. So that is of interest because it wasn't an isolated instance. So you're talking about Camp Century, which is what I cover in the book. Now let's go up to the top of the earth. Let's go to Greenland. So essentially, the US was running, again, a small nuclear reactor to run what it had called Camp Century. And that part of Camp Century was a underground ice town, essentially, for military personnel. It had a bowling alley, it had a barber shop, and again, after this amazing pod has wrapped, hop onto YouTube and type in Camp Century, and there's a really good 10, 12-minute US military backed, 101 of what the people were doing up there. And it shows all the images of how they built this camp. It was, rammed ice. It was a feat of of engineering and of American military foresight. And it was powered by a nuclear reactor. And setting aside the issues that Denmark may or may not have had at the time with that happening on Greenland, the, end point and the motivating factor for having this ice town, this kind of secret military outpost up in Greenland, was to obviously store nuclear weapons, but also as the Americans were cracking on with, the depths of the Cold War with Soviet Russia. Again, go back to a map of the Arctic and have a look at Greenland. You can see that Greenland is this valuable piece of real estate. It is a buffer, a front doorstep to the North American continent. So anything that's going to be firing over from the Soviet Union in the Koala Peninsula, which is where the majority of Russian nuclear assets have been and still remain, it was going to come over or through Denmark. So having radar systems that can capture and monitor any activity there was always going to be kind of the absolute basic necessity for the security of the American homeland. So if that was happening in the Cold War, fast forward to today, the idea, and this is part of the heart of my book, the idea that owning Greenland is a uniquely Trump thing is so beyond the mark. I mean, it's not correct. Greenland has had a place in US military strategic interest, in US defense of the homeland strategy for decades. So that's, I guess, what I wanted to get to in my book when I was trying to not water down the idea that Trump himself or the administration was trying to take Greenland. I really just wanted to come from a point of, these are the facts, this is the history, and this is why, as an American, and I guess as an allied state, if I'm thinking of those in the North Atlantic Treaty Organization area, so Europe, you want, that insurance policy of the US forces maintaining a position and a foothold in Greenland. So that's this kind of, that's the story, I guess, of the US security relationship with Greenland. What was interesting to me, though, as a researcher, was the way in which, and you mentioned just before about the poles. So today, what's happening today in Greenland? Yes, the Greenlandic people will have independence, and it's not an if, it's a when. So we know that, but various things have to happen in order for that to be a sustainable, right, independence. So, and they're well aware of that. And we have 57,000 people, but you have an aging workforce. So the idea that they could unlock their own critical mineral wealth and offshore hydrocarbons and kind of secure their independence and be economically sustainable and viable on their own without needing the block grant support from Denmark, that's problematic because, like, you need, and you'd understand, Gabriella, like, this is a workforce, it's extractive industries require, manpower.
Yeah.
And so are you going to import that manpower? Where's it coming from? Well, I can tell you right now, what you can afford to make things viable is Chinese labor. Can you trust that? So this story of what the Greenlandic people want also, gets a vote in the story of Greenland and its strategic relevance. So it's not an if for independence, it's a when. But I guess and that's where my book kind of ends, is with a few scenarios, because it can go either way. But what we know now is that the current polling and any engagement with the Greenlandic people on what they want for their future, for their children, is, you're absolutely right. It's not we want to be part of America. We want to be another state. But at the same time, and this is what kind of irked me about a lot of the coverage of Greenland, the Greenland-US relationship, at the same time, it's not we want to stay under Denmark's thumb, right? What a lot of the coverage was missing was the fact that they also entirely, a majority, a clear majority, seek to be independent from Denmark. So the way in which it's framed as an either or is disingenuous. And in the book I propose, I think, 4 scenarios for where I think it might fall. So we can chat about that.
Well, I want to speak briefly as we round up the conversation, because this is extremely fascinating and I've learned even more than what you've stated in the book. But I think for kind of a contemporary context, of course, it's full of bountiful natural resources. There are 25 of 34 critical minerals that the EU and others, I think including the US, are eyeing in terms of establishing partnerships with critical minerals. We saw this with President Trump, like I mentioned, establish a more succinct deal with Australia and lots of people in kind of the South Pacific, to lots of Malaysia, Japan, et cetera, to kind of pull away from China's orbit, which is very good and strategic in my opinion. Greenland is kind of being eyed for that. I think I saw a few weeks ago, or leading up to us talking, there have been some headlines about several American interests, possibly going to be investing in Greenland. There are some deals in the works, and maybe not this campaign to sabotage or whatever. So maybe things are quietly happening in terms of business dealings between America, Denmark, Greenland, European interests, and the like. Just because of this, like you said, heightened fear with China. There's also potentially an ecotourism industry. And I would hope if we do, if the US and Greenland enter some sort of more established partnership beyond the defense capabilities on critical minerals, I would suspect that American energy workers or miners would probably go to Greenland, hopefully European ones too. I think they would want to see that as well, not just only China or having China as a presence there. But there's also, like you mentioned, a lot of fish. I'm trying to think in terms of wildlife. I forget if they have caribou there or some other big game. Oh, they have muskox. That's what they have. But you can hunt muskox, but it's not like deer where it's ubiquitous and found everywhere. I'm trying to think what else would be. I feel like fly fishing would be more of a draw, or ecotourism, like seeing the northern lights.
You hit the nail on the head. Like the ecotourism is a space in which we don't traditionally think of it as a strategic good, but it absolutely is becoming.
I feel like
one.
It's,
and if you
in Greenland's case, yes.
Yeah. And if you just look at what's happening with the majority of cruise ships that are now visiting the Arctic, I mean, they're full of high-paying Chinese nationals who are throwing money at being able to get into the Arctic. So it's huge, and that's a space in which I think the American industry can step away from it just being about investing in critical minerals and fisheries and this strategic, I guess, positioning for space and for security matters of Greenland for the US interest, but also in terms of like investing in educating or in tertiary education for tourism sector. So what are the lessons that the Greenlandic people can learn? Is there the opportunity to open like a smaller kind of community college that focuses on how, you know, the hospitality industry operates? How do you run hotels? How do you run, you know, high standard food and beverage provisions? You know, so this is something that the American position, I think, can be bolstered on Greenland by. So it's not all about, you know, the sexy kind of critical mineral and strategic wealth of
recreational experiences.
Greenland.
Absolutely,
recreational for sure. Yeah. So that's unlocking.
I feel like it's also,
I guess,
I feel like sorry, no, it's all good. I feel like they could also borrow a lot and look to Iceland, which was in a similar position to it, had different change of hands. They formally gained their independence. They're an EU nation. I'm sorry, they're not an EU nation. They're a NATO member, but they're not EU. I learned that when I visited a few months ago. I wanted to put the correct facts out there, of course. So not part of the EU, but they work with the EU in some capacity, but they're NATO. But they have a very robust tourism business. I feel like that's something that the Greenlanders can borrow.
It is. And
adopt,
I mean, that, and that's something that triggers a lot of Danish political representatives is when I trot out that kind of comparison, because of course Iceland used to be part of the Danish realm, right?
Yes.
And so now, and for those that are listening that perhaps don't have that point of history, during the Nazi Germany occupation of Denmark, the Icelandic people came together and pretty quickly, you know, said, right, this isn't for us. Let's take the opportunity now to vote for independence. And they unilaterally exited the Danish realm, right? So they had that opportunity and now they're independent. And so some people would argue, well, Greenland could borrow from that and just unilaterally exit. And to which I would say that has kind of already been in on the playbook for, you know, a decade or so. What are we, 2009, so 10, over a decade, with the Self-Determination Act, which the Danish government passed, which allows for Greenlandic independence. So that's really fascinating. So the idea that there's kind of this tension in which Greenland and Denmark can't separate, I say, well, look at the evidence. It's actually in the Danish constitution now that Greenland has the opportunity to seek independence should it wish. What's really important, though, about that is the fine print, right? And that's a little asterisk on that.
As you laid out in the book.
In my book, which I unpack, which has to be done by a referendum. Oh, and in Greenland. And the results of the referendum in Greenland, quote, you know, need to be approved by the Danish parliament. And that's what I unpack in the book. I'm like, you know, why would Denmark, you know, cut off its healthy leg? Because that is what Greenland is to Denmark. And that's a really good way we can wrap up this discussion about the Greenlandic critical mineral wealth and its resource wealth, because that is what Greenland brings to Denmark. So it is the Greenlandic strategic position. If you think, again, about a map of the Arctic, if your listeners are aware of the seabed claims in the Arctic, I'll give a really, really quick 101. So essentially, all of the expected hydrocarbons, oil and gas wealth in the Arctic Circle, the majority of it falls well within territorial boundaries. But a large amount that is left, and we think it's mainly oil and gas, is beneath the seabed towards the North Pole. So if you're looking down on the Arctic from the North Pole, if you look, you will see at the moment there are only 3 claims to the North Pole, the seabed of the North Pole, and that is overlapping. So Russia, Canada, and Denmark. But Denmark's claim is only made possible by way of Greenland. right? So it is the Greenlandic strategic position that allows, when we apply UN law of the sea, the international law, to the claim that Greenland can make to extend its exclusive economic zone, so it can own the rights to extracting and profiting off the resources found, right up to the north, to the seabed of the North Pole. So we know that when the ice, starts to obviously recede further and it becomes commercially viable to tap those seabed resources, that is what Denmark is also eyeing, right? That gives it a huge injection into its economic, its government coffers, but only because Greenland is there from which it piggybacks the claim. So losing Greenland is huge in that sense, but it's also huge in a military strategic way, because we know that Denmark for a long time has pointed to Greenland and said to its NATO allies, well, we might not be spending as much as we should on our defence, but we give you Greenland. We let you. So obviously we are nerding out way too much on Greenland. Zoom has even kicked us off. But the military strategic benefit obviously is something that Denmark has to balance. So when it comes down to the idea of Greenland being independent, it's going to have a sustainable economic base to do so. So that's what we've seen in the last kind of few months. We've seen a lot of EU interest, and they've opened their first consulate or embassy presence in Greenland since. The French are also very interested as well. There's been less interest from the Chinese, again, in Greenland. And some people would argue that that's, a positive thing, and we've dealt with the China problem in the Arctic. And I would argue two things. First of all, we know that on Svalbard and in Iceland, China is very, very active. I don't think we've heard the last of China in Greenland. I think that the Greenlandic people, especially the political leaders, are smart enough to be able to play off concerns from the US and Denmark about China against the China potential for investment. I wonder if we will see more of that, so sort of refusing to allay fears from the West of a Chinese foothold in Greenland by welcoming critical mineral investment. I wonder if that might come online soon. And that's, it's their own prerogative. It's what an independent state does, right? You have to make your own foreign policy and defence choices, and that's something that I think the Greenlandic people are seeking as part of their independence. But a second data point for me about China's potential interest in Greenland comes from the fact that we might see China completely refuse to play ball and just focus on the Central Arctic Ocean and, exploit the seabed minerals as it sees fit, because there are various ways in which, from the Australian point of view, we are watching China in the Antarctic kind of work around the edges and in the grey zone of rules and norms to get their own way. And if you don't have the capability to push back, there's no point trying to bang on the drum and point out behaviour that you cannot respond to. And so that comes, I guess, to a broader point about Arctic security and the role of Greenland. And that's, it's one thing to be getting up in arms about a Trump design or desire to own Greenland, but there's a bigger discussion that needs to be had here, and that's about, why you would want to own Greenland, and that's about the security of the North American continent and the homeland.
What's super fascinating, I'm not sure if this is on your radar, but this is another industry that might pop up in Greenland. But Arctic Ice, it's a company, so they want to ship glacial ice cubes to posh, bougie places in Dubai and all over the world. So I'm not sure if this is also another way using.
That's another thing, and oh my God, we could nerd out about polar security forever. But another comparative data point for you, Gabriella, is that a Dubai-based firm, a private firm, has been trying to tow icebergs from the Antarctic for fresh water. Yeah, so there is so many levels to, the polar regions and their role in international security. And, one of the most interesting is the private sector and high value net wealth companies and families who see these theatres, as their play zones. They're not so removed from the rest of the world like they used to be, and they're not so pristine. And for Greenland especially, I just hope that the Greenlandic people are able to unlock the resource benefits that are locked up in their land, but also able to do so in a way that is sustainable and able to be done in a way that respects their land and their people well into the future.
That's what Malik Rasmussen from Arctic Ice, he's a co-founder. This is a Guardian article that I'm referencing, they want to kind of sell this side of their glaciers globally wide. So I want to thank you, Dr. Buchanan, for coming on. It's been such a riveting conversation. I've learned I need to study up the Arctic, and you just gave me a great inspiration to do so a little bit more. And I follow this kind of loosely. Now you've given me more of an interest to have a keen eye over this region more. I have some national security friends who've always told me you have to pay attention. It has a lot of overlap with what you're working on. So I will direct everyone to get the book, to follow you on Twitter. And I hope we can talk again if something like this comes up in the news.
Absolutely. Yes. You Americans, you need to be on the Arctic. It is your front doorstep. And it's on fire. Thanks, Gabriella.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Good to talk to you. If you enjoyed this installment of District of Conservation, I would love to know your feedback. Send it my way. Please be sure to leave us reviews on Apple, Spotify, or wherever podcasts are played, and also check us out on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter to never miss a beat nor a guest announcement. Thanks so much for listening to District of Conservation. I hope you have a wonderful day, and please share the podcast to those who may be interested in learning more about these critical natural resources, environment, energy issues.